Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Tokuhama, and I am a Senior Assistant Director of Admission here in the Office of Admission at Northwestern. And I'm joined by my colleague, Val Smith, who I'm super excited to see. We have been, like many of you in the country, locked down in COVID, and so to see someone in person is just super exciting for us. And we're here to talk about the admission interview. And so I'm going to turn it over to Val really quickly to kind of talk a little bit about her experience interviewing students and a little bit about our process and kind of tee up what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, welcome everyone. So glad to be here with you. It's great to see Chris in person after many months of online meetings. My name is Val Smith. I am a Senior Assistant Director of Admission here in the Office of Admission at Northwestern. And I also direct our Alumni Admission Council, which is Northwestern's group of alumni volunteers who conduct thousands of admission interviews for us every year. And we are excited to be talking with you about the admission interview today. Chris and I both have admission interview experience beyond Northwestern. Prior to coming here, I worked at a different college where I interviewed hundreds of students for admission and scholarships every year. So we have some insight to talk to you about the admission experience and preparation for making your interview a great one and a really helpful part of your college search process.
And I think for us where this started was we have worked in this industry long enough where students have a lot of anxiety, or we've heard a lot of questions about the interview. And we wanted to address that because I think it is something that, especially in this year of COVID and things are changing, one of the things where students are kind of unsure about what to expect, how to prepare, it's just a thing where for us, we want to kind of give some clarity to the process as much as possible. So that's kind of why we're here today, and we're going to be talking for about a half an hour or so about it. But to kind of kick off, I think one of the things that we often think about when we're thinking about the interview process is, why does a school interview, right? Like, what is it that a school is intending to do? Why even have it? And this is to say, a caveat up front that every school does things a little bit differently. So we're going to be talking as broadly as possible, but certainly, we're going to refrain back to this, check back with the schools that you're interested in for the specifics. But to sort of kind of start broadly, Val, when you're thinking about schools and sort of why we ask for interviews or what we hope to get out of it, what comes to the top of your mind of kind of the interview process and kind of talking to students in that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the number one goal of any college or university that is asking students to complete an admission interview, and this is true whether it is a required part of their process or an optional part of their process, is that it's another opportunity for a school to get to know a student in a different way. The interview conversation is more lively, it's less scripted than what we might read in an essay or in the activities list on the Common or Coalition or other application. And so the interview is a way to add additional context and life and information to your file. And that's what I think most admission officers are looking for when they read an interview report or when they invite students to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that idea about getting to know a student better is really kind of the thing that I want to highlight, right? This idea where it's not necessarily a thing where you as a student have to kind of impress us or try to kind of come across as the most well-spoken, articulate person in a full business suit kind of situation. I think we're ultimately just trying to get to know you a little bit better. And the way that I often phrase it to students is that we are sometimes trying to fill in the gaps in an application. Part of the trick is that sometimes we don't even have your application in hand when we're interviewing you. Sometimes those interviews happen prior. And so we're trying to anticipate the kinds of things that we would want to know in the application. But ultimately, I think, what we tell students is that we want you to kind of just share things that are relevant with us. And to say, on the other end, we're not trying to pressure you to talk about things that you might feel uncomfortable talking about. We're not looking to uncover trauma or necessarily ask you about kind of, how COVID has impacted you this past year. It's more kind of the other side to say, like, what as you as a student would you like to share with us, right? We wanted to craft a space where you feel welcome and able to do that. And the interview is a space where sometimes students are kind of able to talk about things that they can't do in writing, right? They're able to sort of have that conversation, and maybe they don't know how to articulate that in writing, or they're not wanting to be as formal, and so the interview is a great chance for them to do that. But kind of on that note, this idea of sharing information, I think that's kind of one end of the spectrum in terms of interviews, and we call them informative kind of interviews. They are designed to kind of provide information or share information, but there are also things called evaluative interviews, or there's a component of that. Val, could you talk a little bit more about how schools might use the the interview as kind of an evaluation piece.
Yeah, so many of you might be familiar with a term called holistic admission. It's a process that Northwestern and many other schools use to approach the admission process. There is another video in this series that we offer on YouTube that goes into much more detail on holistic admission, so definitely check that out if you haven't already. But when it comes to the interview fits in this puzzle that the holistic admission process is bringing together. So it is one additional piece of information that, as we've said, allows us to get to know you, to learn a little bit more about your history, the ways that you've been invested in your school or local community, the academic progress and growth that you've shown over the course of 4 years. So from an evaluative standpoint, the interview really allows us to understand some of those other facts and figures that we see on paper in your application. We're not evaluating an interview in the sense of, has the student done 15 interviews before, and are they the most sort of polished, or do they have the answers ready to go right away? It's not evaluative like a job interview. It's evaluative in the sense that it adds some additional richness to your admission file, and it helps us understand our understanding of your academic preparation and your fit for our campus community more broadly.
And I think the best example that I often give to students is something like an activity summary, right? Where a student might list something on their resume, and the Common App gives you 150 characters to describe that activity, which is not a lot of space. But through an interview, a student has the time to kind of develop that idea of what they were involved in, what their impact was, why they chose to be involved in that activity in the first place, all that kind of information. And that's sort of really helpful for us in this umbrella of holistic admission, as Val was talking about, to sort of understand context, right? Because our hope is that for many students, they've been involved in activities that are going to help them contribute to their future campus in some form. And the activity summary or a resume don't always help us understand that as fully as a student's story about that activity might. So this is really the case where it is, for many schools, kind of evaluative in that form, as Val was saying. It's not designed to be a high pressure thing where we are not judging you against the 10 other students we might be interviewing that day. We're not trying to look and see, who can answer a specific question the best, or even necessarily who, is saying that they are wanting to go to the school as a first choice, right? It's really about kind of the qualitative contextual information along the way. But I think, when we're thinking about interviews and sort of helping students to prepare for it, part of it is also understanding, how do you actually kind of, as a student who probably haven't interviewed before, or maybe haven't interviewed prior to being a high school senior, how do you sort of get equipped to start that process? What do you need to know? Because I think we get a lot of questions often from students who are asking things along the lines of like, how do I prepare? What do I do? And all that sort of stuff. And so again, in the spirit of staying broad, I think we want to kind of talk about kind of general ideas or tactics that students want to employ in order to sort of go about that process. But I think part of that is for us understanding in many ways how a student just even starts the process, right? When we were requesting interviews and going along those lines, different schools will treat those differently. Do you want to kind of speak, Val, to kind of how we at Northwestern kind of approach that process and how it might differ from the interview process at other schools?
Absolutely. So at Northwestern, all of our interviews are completed off campus in a place that is local to students by members of our Alumni Admission Council. These are trained volunteers who love Northwestern and are really excited to share their experience and their perspective about campus with all of you during the process. So here, we email students who reside in a location that is near to one of our alumni interviewers, and we invite them to request an interview. It's an entirely optional part of the process, and we can talk a little bit more about why students might want to take advantage of an optional interview. But it really is up to the student to take advantage of that and then to coordinate a meeting with an alum local to them. This year, of course, in light of the health situation around us, our interviews are virtual or digital. Other schools are likely following a similar format based on public health guidelines. But in a typical year where students are able to visit college campuses, you may also have an experience where you are interviewing with a member of the admission staff on campus. Perhaps you'll come for a tour, you'll wander campus with a current student, and then you'll sit down for 30 or 45 minutes with an admission staff member to talk about your experiences and your interest in that particular school. That's what I was familiar with prior to coming to Northwestern. I think you've had similar experiences in the past. So know that whether it is an alumni, a member of the alumni community, whether it is a staff member. At some schools, it may even be a current student. Many schools offer an internship program for seniors that allows them to conduct interviews with prospective students. All of those interviewers are going to have the same goal, and that they want to get to know you and they want to help you add that additional context and information to your file.
Well, and I think you mentioned kind of in the beginning this idea of it could happen, the interview could happen at a coffee shop, but it could be on campus. And I think that logistics piece is important for students to figure out, right? Not in terms of that they have to kind of, go Google mapping it and sort of figure everything out down to the last detail, but just generally get a sense of how the school is conducting interviews, and especially in this year with COVID, and as you mentioned, everything has gone a little bit haywire. Is a school going to do a Zoom interview? Are they doing it over phone? What do you need to do to prepare for that kind of on the logistics end? I think as much as you can sort that out prior to the interview, that is going to kind of help students tamp down a little bit on the stress. But I should say, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's a very fair question to ask, right?
Yes.
If you're ever unclear about that, hopefully we'll have that information on our websites or in our communications to you. But I feel like if you're ever unclear about, okay, you mentioned a Starbucks, but there's 3 Starbucks in a 2-block radius. Can you clarify that? I think those kinds of questions we always would love to have, sooner rather than later, because my worst fear is it's the day of the interview, 5 minutes prior, and you would get an email from a student saying, I'm lost, I don't know where I am, and I'm like, I there's only so much I can do, right? I'm here. But so if you are ever unsure about that, always ask. I don't think anyone will ever be mad at you for bringing up that question. But thinking about logistics stuff really quickly and sort of preparing for the interview, one of the other things that we often sort of think about, when we're helping students prepare is kind of getting comfortable in that space.
Yes.
And part of it is, finding the location prior so you're not like running late. But also, I think a lot of students struggle with the idea of how do I present myself in person in terms of I'm talking to an adult perhaps for the first time and having a conversation with them. It's not something that you might necessarily do on a day-to-day basis. How do I dress for an interview and things like that? So do you have like thoughts or tips about kind of how to address that?
Yeah, I do. I think my number one tip is what you have already said, which is when in doubt, ask. Admission officers and staff members are here to assist you throughout the process. We don't want the interview to be a test. We don't want it to be an especially stressful experience for you. And so as much as you can know ahead of time about what to expect during that conversation, the more confident you are going to feel. So if there are questions or concerns or things that you're nervous about, feel free to address them ahead of time with your interviewer or with the admission staff member who's helping you to coordinate that experience. What I typically tell students is prepare to make yourself comfortable so that you can just be the best version of yourself. Let's talk about dress, for example. I get a lot of questions from students about, are your interviews business casual? Do I need to wear a Northwestern sweatshirt? What if I don't own one yet? How can I show my best self when I walk in the door to that coffee shop or wherever the interview may be? And I typically advise students here, we don't have a dress code for our interviews. We don't expect that students will come like they're dressed for a boardroom or for a corporate job interview. So dress in a way that you feel really confidently about. Dress in a way that is going to help you be your best self. There's a lot of wonderful personal expression that comes through the way we dress, and it's perfectly fine to show that off in an interview. But if you are uncomfortable about what you're wearing, either because it's very casual or because you maybe haven't worn a tie in a while and you tied one on ahead of your conversation, that's going to impact the way that you're talking with that representative. So approach the interview, whether it's dress or location or whatever else it may be, and do what you need to do to make sure that you can sit down and take a deep breath and relax and talk about you. I think that's the key here, is that you are the expert on this interview topic. The interview is about you and your experiences, and no one knows that better than you. And the goal of this is that you would be able to shine and to share that information with us. So asking the questions ahead of time about what to expect, be it dress, be it location, even things like, do I need to bring materials to this interview? Are you expecting a resume or copies of any other materials? At Northwestern, we don't expect that students bring that information to an interview setting. Other schools might differ a little bit. So ensuring that you ask those questions ahead of time, I think, is the best way to proceed.
Well, and even to follow up on that, like I've had students ask, if I give you a copy of my resume, can you take it? And at different institutions, sometimes the answer is yes. Like I can add that to your file. And sometimes I would literally say to students like, I can take it, but I'm going to put it in a folder and it's not going to go anywhere. You should submit it, through email or through the online status portal or things like that. And so that's a kind of question that I get a lot from students. Or, I think we've gotten this before too, is like sometimes students come in with a portfolio of things. More often it's related to arts or performance or things along those lines. But one time I had a student who wanted to submit a portfolio of just sketches that he did on the side for fun. And I was like, I can take this for you, but it's not going to go anywhere. And so it's really up to you. And he was like kind of a little bit shocked by that. And I was like, well, I'm trying to be as honest with you as possible. So to get back to your point, it's really like, just ask the school. Like if I were to come to the interview with X, Y, and Z, would that be appropriate? Would that be something that you could do? And I think we'd like to be as upfront as we can about that. I don't think anyone's going to try and, hand wave or kind of make that process more complicated than it needs to be. But thinking about this idea, I really like that phrase that you said about being the best version of yourself. I think that is kind of a great framework for students to think about the interview. And that idea that you are the expert, right? Ultimately, I think for many of us who are conducting interviews, it's about guiding the conversation. It's about sort of helping the conversation move smoothly. But you as the person being interviewed know all the answers. That is the secret of the interview. Any question that we ask, you are going to know the answer to, hopefully. And it's really a case where, what we want to do is to encourage you to feel comfortable in that space to kind of share that information. And so I mentioned that because I've had a lot of students, and you might have had this too, Val, where they come in and they're just so over-prepared and they have a script, and you can see the gears kind of churning in their head of like what they wanted to say. What I tell students quite often is that, many times I think it's helpful to have a set of talking points of things that you think are important and that you want to convey to the admission committee. And the way that I phrase that is, imagine that you are standing in front of the admission committee, this imaginary group of folks, and you can talk to them about whatever you want. You have the floor, you have a captive audience. Right. What would you think is most important for them to know about you, right? That's probably some of the information that would want to appear in the interview. And it's really a case where that's the kind of stuff in the background that I want a student to have, but not have their entire interview planned out, or to say like, if a student, an interviewer asks me, why are you applying to a school like Northwestern? I have this 50-second response, right? Because I think ultimately at the end of the day, we can sense that students are kind of over-prepared. And we're human. We want to connect with you, and that sort of gets in the way of that. And so as much as you can, I think, have an idea, have some preparation about kind of what your thoughts are about things, but don't go so far necessarily as to kind of like rehearse answers to questions. It's ultimately a conversation, and that's the best way that I can phrase it.
Yeah, it's not a rehearsed question and answer. It's not a frequently asked question list about yourself. It is a conversation with another human, and I think thinking about it from that perspective will help you feel more authentic about the answers that you're giving.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think we want you to feel good about the process, right? And I think Val, you champion this as well, is to feel like, after you leave the interview, like you feel really good about it. And what's the phrase that you use? Like you rock the interview, or?
Yeah, that's my goal when I interview students, or when I did in the past, is that, no matter what we covered in that conversation, I want students to walk away feeling like they rocked it, like they were able to share the things that they love about themselves and the work that they've done over the past 4 years. Creating that environment where students can be excited about that was exciting to me as an interviewer, and it's what I hope is happening with our alumni interviewers that I work with as well.
Yeah, and I think that's, so if you can sort of like take a step back and say, there might be an element of the interview that is evaluative, as we talked about earlier, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's for you as a student to feel like you were able to convey the information that you needed to the school, that you feel good about the process, to clarify any questions that you might have about the interview process or admission process itself. And so I think, a lot of times our alums will leave kind of an open-ended period at the end where they can our students can ask questions. It's a great chance for you as a student to say like, oh, okay, I'm not really sure about what to do next, or maybe I wanted some more clarification about a particular program, and the alum interviewer might not have the exact answer on their fingertips. fingertips, but generally speaking, they can probably refer you to someone so you can get that answer. And that's a perfectly valid reason to have an interview, right? And I think at the end of the day for us, it boils down to, why should I interview is the question. And the answer that I kind of jokingly give is because you have a reason to, right? There's something that you want to convey to the admission committee. There's a question that you have. Maybe you want to learn more about the student experience and sort of want to talk to one of our alum interviewers about that. I think all of those reasons are perfectly fine. The worst interviews that I had, and not negatively impacting a student, but just sort of like I didn't get a lot out of them, and kind of what we talked about earlier, that's one of our goals, is I've had students who, when I worked for another institution, talked about our football team for 20 minutes. And I was like, that's great. I can have that conversation with you, and I'm happy to do that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, that doesn't help me understand why I should admit you more, right? It's different if a student says, look, I'm looking for a school that has a large sense of school spirit. I really love being in an atmosphere at a stadium where there's a lot of people who are painting their faces, and that's something that I'm looking for. I want that sense of community, and it's revolving around athletics. That tells me a little bit about a student, right? That's something that I can use. But a student who wants to talk to me about our star quarterback, I'm like, okay, we can talk about stats, and we can talk about sort of what's happening, but that's not helpful for me at the end of the day. And so it's really kind of that idea of sort of understanding why you're interviewing as a student and kind of getting that in your head before you come to the interview that I think is really, really important. Yeah. But to kind of close out, are there any sort of last minute tips or thoughts that you have about the interview process that we haven't covered, or things that you thought were important for students to know?
Yeah, I think a couple of things I want to reiterate. One, I love what you said about using the interview as an opportunity to ask questions. And I think students should go into these conversations knowing that it is a learning tool for them. It is another avenue in the college search process to learn more about an institution from a firsthand perspective. And my advice to students throughout the college search process is whether you are talking to a tour guide or an admission staff member or an alumni interviewer or a faculty member, remember that colleges and universities are large and diverse and complex places made up of people who have all different perspectives and priorities. And so I encourage you to take these conversations as one of many layers in your journey to get to know a school. I always worry a little bit when students make a college decision and say yes or no to an institution based on one conversation or one interaction with a current student. Know that your experience on our campus and on many other campuses is going to be the sum of the parts, right? It's going to be the experiences that you have with so many different people. And to the extent that you can get to know those different perspectives in the college search process, I think it's a valuable thing. Think of the interview as one other opportunity to do that. Alumni, especially our alumni who conduct these interviews, they have wonderful Purple Pride. And they have these amazing stories to share about their experiences on campus and how Northwestern has launched them into careers after graduation. Those stories matter. And I think that students should take advantage of the opportunities that they have to hear more stories. And the interview is one way to do that. So certainly think of it as an informational and a learning tool for you. As much as it is a learning tool for admission staff to get to know you, you are also getting to know the institution. The other thing I wanted to say is that there will be cases where you might not be able to interview at a particular school, either because they have limited capacity in the number of interviews they offer. Many places like Northwestern are totally reliant on volunteers who are giving their time and their energy to do these interviews, and so they may not be able to meet with everyone. And other schools might not offer interviews for whatever reason. And so know that in a holistic process like ours, admission decisions never come down to one singular factor. I can't think of an admission interview that I've conducted in my career that sort of was a done deal and made the decision for a student. To your point earlier, they can help us understand your fit and give us reasons why you're going to be a great addition to the community, but they're rarely the determining factor. So don't panic if it's an experience that either maybe doesn't go the way you want it to go or that doesn't happen for whatever reason. Know that there are lots of ways to get to know a community and to share that information about yourself with the admission committee.
And I think that's an important point to underscore, and this is kind of the take-home message, is I think a lot of times students put a lot of pressure on themselves when it comes to the interview in terms of, will this interaction make or break my college application process? Because I think for a lot of students, they think about it in terms of like they are interacting one-on-one with a representative of an institution, and the impression that they give, they think, has this outsized kind of weight in the process. And for us, Val alluded to this earlier, we're not able to interview everyone who wants an interview. And so it would be unfair for us to kind of put too much weight on that. And many other schools are in similar boats. I think there's a lot of schools, especially at the more selective end of the spectrum, that just have more requests than they can handle. Yeah. And so we can't, say one application or, because a student interviewed that they should have, a better chance of getting in or anything like that. And so this is really the case where I would say as a student, if you're looking at school, certainly ask as well in terms of, is the interview a form of demonstrated interest? Is there a thing where, I should be interviewing if I'm really interested in a school? Or is it really a case where it's just a chance to kind of, provide more information about the school and kind of interact with someone? There's many different ways that schools will look at it. So I think it's a question that you definitely want to ask. But we were joking earlier to kind of bring it to a close. This idea of tamping down the stress is really where we want to get at. And Val and I both watch a lot of television and different kind of shows, and we were joking. I think one of the challenges is that there's so much representation in the media about kind of the college interview as a thing, right? Val had mentioned Gilmore Girls. I was talking about Gossip Girl. And like, there's all these things where students are just like, I have to like ride or die and I have to go and get this interview or my life is over. And that's not the case. I think for many students, it is a thing where we would love to have you interview. If you feel like you have something to say, please come and chat with us. We would love to kind of get to know you a little bit better. But you don't have to bend over backward to get an interview. We've had students, I literally had a student who was like, I will fly on a plane for 2 hours to an interview. And I'm like, if that's what you want to do with your life, I'm not going to stop you. I don't control you, but you don't need to do that. And so that's really the kind of thing where I want to speak to that, because I think a lot of times students are looking for any advantage that they can in the process, right? And they think that an interview is one form of that, and they kind of stress themselves out trying to get an interview, clicking the button as soon as interviews become available to register for them. It is okay. And I should say that I'm speaking from a place of us at Northwestern. Certainly check with other schools about it. But it's really a thing where what we want for you as a student, again, is to share information and feel good about it. And I fundamentally believe that you folks as young people are interesting, that you have stories to tell, and that there's stuff there, that there's depth. And it's always really exciting, as you talked about, Val, when a student rocks the interview, yes. Right? When they do a really good job, their eyes light up, they shine, they start talking about something that they really, really love. Like about a decade ago, it was Rubik's Cubes. Like I've had students talk about sort of like all kinds of the quirky things that they love. And that's the part where it gets really interesting, where it's kind of not as fun as where students are just like by the book and they're like, this is my favorite academic activity. But when they sort of go into, this is why that activity is interesting to me, or this is the club that I founded because no one in my school district was able to study this thing that I care so much about, that's the kind of thing that's amazing. Yep. And so this is what I would encourage you to do as a student, is to sort of shine and do the thing that you think that you do awesome, right? Yeah. Go out there and feel like you are able to convey that information and that you rock the interview, and that, you don't have to, again, it's not about impressing us, but it's about helping us sort of understand what makes you shine. And so with that, that's kind of everything that I sort of think about in terms of the process. And I do want to sort of bring it to a close. So any last thoughts, Val?
No, I don't. I think that was a great reminder to know that the priority for everyone involved in this process is you. It's making sure that you feel like you can go through the college search and admission process having put your best foot forward, having shared the things that mattered to you, and having the resources to really get to know a school inside and out, so that you can make a decision that means you're going to wind up on a campus where you thrive as a student, sure, but far more importantly as a person and as a community member. If you want a laugh, if you want a what not to do when it comes to admission interviews and admission anxiety, do watch the 3rd season of Gilmore Girls. I'm going to just recommend that in your free time during our shelter-in-place pandemic quarantine life that we're living. And I say that I'm only semi-serious. I think it's funny because it's wildly outdated and inaccurate at this point, as much as I love the show. But I also want you to know to use your current staff members and the resources that you have at a college to get your questions and concerns answered. Be careful what you read online on, forums and other websites about the interview process, and go straight to the source. The people involved want to help you, and they want to help you shine. So that's where I think I want to land today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. time, Val, and it's a pleasure to chat with you as always.
Always.
I really love these kind of applied learning series because I think that they draw out a lot of thoughts that we have as admission counselors,
Yes.
and it's very rare that we get to actually have a conversation with each other
I know,
about
this is
some of this
fun.
stuff. But to that point, if there's other things that you're interested in, I think there's other videos in the applied learning series. Definitely check them out on our YouTube channel. The goal with a lot of them is to just help provide good information for you as students. And so they are a little bit on the longer side, but I think that they're well worth it if you have the time, and certainly check them out. But thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. It was a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day.